The café smelled of roasted espresso beans and freshly baked pastries, but Sophie Carter barely noticed. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her mind drifting as she stared out the rain-speckled window. Outside, the city moved in a hurried blur, people rushing to work, lovers walking arm in arm, conversations lost in the morning bustle. Inside, she sat alone, her wedding ring cool against her skin, a reminder of a life that had once felt full but now felt empty. Her husband, Ethan, had left early as always, a quick peck on her cheek his only acknowledgement of her existence. Their conversations had dwindled to schedules and forgotten grocery lists. The passion that once burned between them had faded into cold predictability. Sophie didn't want to admit it, but loneliness had crept into her bones, settling there like a permanent ache. The soft chime of the café's doorbell broke her thoughts. She glanced up just as he walked in. James Whitmore. Sophie had noticed him before. A distinguished older man, always impeccably dressed, carrying an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't conventionally handsome, not in the way young men were, but there was something undeniably magnetic about him. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his sharp blue eyes held a knowing glint. This morning their eyes met. He smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that felt like a question. Sophie's pulse quickened as he walked past her table, taking a seat nearby. She didn't expect anything more than that. After all, she was just another patron in the café, another nameless face in the crowd. But then, "Excuse me." His voice was deep, rich, carrying the weight of experience. Sophie turned, startled. "Yes, I hope I'm not intruding," he said, gesturing to the book beside her untouched coffee. "But I couldn't help noticing. You seem quite lost in thought." Sophie hesitated. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about his words, yet something about his gaze unsettled her. Or perhaps it wasn't his gaze at all. Perhaps it was the way she felt under it. Acknowledged. She forced a small smile. "Just a long morning. Then allow me to brighten it." He extended a hand. James Whitmore. She hesitated for only a second before slipping her fingers into his. His grip was firm, warm, lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Sophie Carter. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "A beautiful name. It suits you." Polite flattery, nothing more. And yet, Sophie felt a blush creep up her neck. She withdrew her hand, reaching for her coffee in a futile attempt to steady herself. James leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I see you here often." Her heart skipped. "You do?" He nodded. "Always alone. Always lost in thought." A silence stretched between them. Sophie could have laughed it off, dismissed his observation as mere politeness, but something in his voice held her captive. There was an intimacy in the way he spoke, as though he had peeled back a layer of her soul with nothing but a glance. She cleared her throat. "I suppose I just like the quiet." James's smile deepened. "Or perhaps you crave something beyond it." Sophie inhaled sharply. It was dangerous, this conversation, this man. She should have excused herself, should have walked away. But she didn't. Instead, she let herself linger in his gaze, in the warmth of his voice, in the way he made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted. James didn't push. He simply sipped his coffee, as if content to let the moment unfold at its own pace. There was patience in his presence, a confidence that suggested he understood exactly what he was doing. And Sophie. She wasn't sure she wanted him to stop. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, casting a muted glow through the café's large windows. The world beyond felt distant, irrelevant, as though it belonged to another life entirely. "Tell me something, Sophie," James said, setting his cup down with deliberate ease. "When was the last time you felt truly alive?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. And for the first time in a long time she realized, she didn't know the answer. The next time Sophie saw James Whitmore, it wasn't by accident. She told herself she had merely needed fresh air, an escape from the walls of her home that had started to feel suffocating. She had wandered into the café without expectation, without any real reason. But the way her pulse quickened as she stepped inside told her otherwise. And there he was, seated at his usual spot, poised with quiet elegance, a newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched coffee. James looked up as she entered, as though he had been waiting for her. A slow smile played at his lips. Mrs. Carter. She hesitated for only a moment before taking the seat across from him. You make it sound so formal. Would you prefer something else? He asked, voice smooth as silk. Sophie exhaled a soft laugh. Just Sophie. James nodded, eyes lingering on her a second longer than necessary. Sophie, then. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Sophie glanced down at her hands, fidgeting with the wedding ring that suddenly felt heavier than usual. Tell me, James mused, watching her with an unreadable expression. What brings you back here today? Sophie could have lied. She could have said she was running errands, that she simply needed a break. But something about James made dishonesty feel pointless. I don't know, she admitted. I just needed to be somewhere else. His gaze sharpened, reading between the words. And your husband? Would he mind you sitting here with a stranger? Sophie stiffened. Ethan. The thought of him should have grounded her, should have reminded her of the life she was tethered to. But instead, it only deepened the void inside her. He wouldn't notice, she murmured. James leaned back in his chair, studying her. Shame. A woman like you should never go unnoticed. The way he said it sent a ripple down her spine. It wasn't just flattery. It was an acknowledgement, a validation of something she had long feared but never voiced. She had become invisible. James took a slow sip of his coffee. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Sophie? She swallowed hard, heart hammering against her ribs. What? A woman who is aching for something more. Something real. Her breath hitched. It was reckless, this conversation. A flirtation with danger, with the unknown. But wasn't that why she was still sitting there? I should go, she whispered half-heartedly. James didn't try to stop her. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, elegant card, placing it gently on the table between them. My number, he said. In case you ever feel the need to be somewhere else again. Sophie stared at the card, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She should leave it. She should walk away. But instead she picked it up. James smiled, as if he had known all along that she would. And as she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the card burning against her palm, Sophie knew something had shifted. She had taken a step too close to the edge. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to turn back. Sophie sat in her dimly lit bedroom, the small card resting in her palm like a forbidden artifact. James Whitmore. A name that now carried weight, a presence that had seeped into the quiet spaces of her mind. She traced the embossed numbers with her fingertips, debating the implications of dialing them. She told herself she wouldn't. She was a married woman, bound by vows that once meant everything. And yet, as she listened to the muffled sound of Ethan's keyboard clacking away in his home office, his world far removed from hers, she felt the weight of her loneliness settle deeper. The moment stretched, the air thick with hesitation. Then, almost against her own will, her fingers moved. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Sophie. Her breath caught. He said her name like it was something to be savored, as if he had been expecting her. She hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. I shouldn't have called. And yet you did. There was no arrogance in his tone, only quiet certainty. That tells me something, doesn't it? Sophie swallowed, her pulse hammering. She should hang up. She should erase his number and pretend this moment never happened. But instead she whispered, Why did you give me your number? James chuckled, the sound deep and knowing. Because I recognized something in you. A longing. Tell me I'm wrong. She couldn't. The silence on the line stretched between them, thick with meaning. Then James spoke again, his voice lower, more deliberate. Come have dinner with me. Sophie's stomach tightened. James. No expectations, he assured her. No pressure. Just two people enjoying an evening together. Nothing more. But they both knew better. The invitation hovered between them, dangerous yet tempting. Sophie exhaled slowly, as if trying to breathe out the guilt clawing at her ribs. Where? Soft chuckle. A place where you won't have to be Mrs. Carter. Just Sophie. She closed her eyes, already teetering on the edge of a choice she couldn't take back. And then, quietly, she said, okay. James didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't need to. Because the moment she answered, they both knew. She had already crossed the line.